Hey everybody, tonight's video is called You're Still in His Hand, and tonight we continue our Passthrough study here in the book of Ecclesiastes, looking at the 9th chapter, and we're going to be looking at what Solomon considers the best way to live under the sun. So Ecclesiastes 9 verse 1 through 6 starting out, says, "For I have considered all this in my heart, so that I could declare it all, that the righteous and the wise in their works are in the hand of God. People know neither love nor hatred by anything they see before them. All things come alike to all. One event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good, the clean, and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. As is the good, so is the sinner. He who takes an oath, as he who fears an oath. This is evil in all that is done under the sun. That one thing happens to all. Truly the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil. Madness is in their hearts while they live. And after that they go to the dead. But for him who is joined to all the living, there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing, and they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Also their love, their hatred, and their envy have now perished. Never more will they have a share in anything done under the sun." So the first key part that I get out of Solomon's words here in verse 1 is that we are all in God's hands. It doesn't matter if you're righteous or wicked. In verse 1, in God's hands, it reminds me of Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon that sparked the revival, sinners in the hands of an angry God. And because of universal depravity, we know from the fall of man that death has come. And we shouldn't measure God's love by what happens in life, but we should measure it by what Jesus has done for us on the cross. And the preacher once again allowed his thoughts of God's sovereign power to develop in a fatalism here. And it seemed as the same things happen to all, that all are going to die without the real meaning revealed in their life. And his idea is all share the same destiny in this meaningless life of ours. And this is certainly how things appear to Solomon with his under the sun premise. And he doesn't like this thought. And we see with a great poetic effect that Solomon puts forth the belief that all existence and consciousness end with this life. And there will be no inequities in the final judgment of the righteous or the wicked, because God remembers both in perfect detail. And in the book of Ecclesiastes, we must understand that God is sovereign, that God sovereignly controls both the righteous and the wicked. And in verse 3, the preacher's emphasizing the corruption of the human nature. And in spite of how dark this world can be, there's hope for the living, even though they'll die, right? Because we have Christ. We know that Christ has sacrificed his life, that he became he was the perfect lamb, that he gave it all, the perfect sacrifice. In verse 7 through 10, it says, "Go eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already accepted your works. Let your garments always be white, and let your head lack no oil. Live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life, which you have given under the sun, all your days of vanity. For this is your portion in life, and in labor which you perform under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. For there is no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you are going." So we see that in verse 7, the preacher's adding the idea that our experience of joy and satisfaction is approved by God. And in verse 8, the wearing of white and the use of oil signify festivity. In verse 9, it is very similar to Solomon's words back in the book of Proverbs, chapter 5, verse 15 through 19, in the Song of Solomon, which, Lord willing, we'll be starting that study here in a couple weeks. And we see that he commends the enjoyment of marriage, though marriage has frustrations and perplexities. And we see that Solomon says essentially to live life to the fullest. And non-believers in God, that's what their mindset is to live life to the fullest. So, they're following what Solomon believed at this time period. In verse 11 and 12 it says, I returned and saw under the sun that the race does not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. For man also does not know his time, like fish taken in a cruel net. Sounds like Solomon is, a ASPCA member or PTA. Like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare. So the sons of men are snared in an evil time, when it falls suddenly upon them. So wisdom cannot guarantee good outcomes because of what appear to be so many unpredictable contingencies. And the preacher is describing people as victims of inscrutable or even cruel chance here. And nevertheless, the believer understands that God orders events in unexpected ways, that our time and everything is in the hands of God. And the time of his misfortune, especially death in verse 12, is meant at his time. And the preacher struggles with the sense of fatalism, wondering if it didn't all happen according to time and chance from under the sun perspective. And it seemed to him that man was more subject to the whims of time and chance than of a loving, all-powerful God. In verse 13 through 15 it says, This wisdom I have also seen under the sun, and it seemed great to me. There was a little city with a few men in it, and a great king came against it, besieged it, and built great snares around it. Now there was found in a poor wise man, and he, by his wisdom, delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that same poor man. So wisdom may not receive its due in this life. In Solomon, we see that he gives a illustration or a story about how a poor wise man whose wisdom saved a city against the siege of a great king. And while this seemed great to Solomon, a wonderful, significant display of wisdom, under the sun premise of his, death ends existence and consciousness for all. And what Solomon is saying is that there's no point of remembrance, as this life is meaningless. In verse 16 through 18 it says, Then I said, Wisdom is better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. Words of the wise spoken quietly should be heard. Rather than the shout of a ruler of fools, wisdom is better than weapons of war. But one sinner destroys much good. So we see the chapter comes to a wrap up in verse 18 there. In verse 16 we know is true because he lacks status and position. And the preacher sees wisdom better than might, but the wise aren't appreciated. And back in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 13 through 16, he taught that good leaders aren't appreciated. And wisdom has value in this life, but it can't yield complete escape from the vanity of life. And all the good that wisdom does can quickly be taken away by just one sinner who destroys much good. And Solomon sensed that it was much easier to destroy than to build. And you give me a project to do that involves taking something apart and putting it back together, or putting, a new part in, like in a car. I guarantee you I can get that part out, with just playing around and figuring it out. But I'm not going to be able to get it back, put back together right. It's easier for us to be demolitionists than it is to be builders. And establishing things by wisdom is much more difficult than destroying them by the work of even one sinner. So to wrap up our video for today, we look tonight at Solomon preach to live life and make the best of a bad thing. And we see that he opens speaking that death happens to everyone. And death is a very common theme that Solomon has in mind in the meaningless of life. No one's going to escape death. In verse 7 through 10, Solomon is essentially saying that such a view of life and death, joy is found in the moment. Now I want to look at Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Verse 25. And if you recall, Solomon says to enjoy marriage. And I believe we have the formula on the best way to enjoy marriage. In Ephesians 5:25 says, husbands, love your wives as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy without blemish. So, men, the best way for you to enjoy the life of marriage is to follow what the Apostle Paul has taught, to love your wives sacrificially. We need to love our wives sacrificially. If men love their wives sacrificially, that is going to make for a better marriage. And I know the world saying is, a happy wife, a better life, but that's not the correct godly formula. But they need to be loved sacrificially. And for ladies, Ephesians 5:22 through 24, it says, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as also Christ is head of the church, and he is Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. So, ladies, when you follow God's guidance on your role in marriage, that's the only way we're going to have a enjoyable marriage. And culture or modern day feminism are not going to bring joy in marriages. As a matter of fact, the movement of the modern day feminists are destroying the goodness of marriages. In verse 11 and 12, it says, Solomon fails time and chance make life under the sun hard to understand. And verse 13 through 15, he shows how wisdom goes unrecognized as it's underappreciated. And many of us have done great things and they've been forgotten. And right now there's a movie out in the theaters. I haven't seen it yet, and I know it has a Catholic woman in it. But there's a movie called Cabrini out there right now in the movie theaters. And before this movie came out, how many of you have heard the name Francesca Cabrini? I've never heard of that name until the movie. So maybe I'm just less educated, I'm not sure. But this woman went to New York City in 1889 on mission to convince the mayor to take care of the community, to secure housing and health care for society's most vulnerable. And as people, we quickly forget, but God never does. In 2 Timothy 2, verse 19, Timothy 2:19, it says, nevertheless, the solid foundation of God stands, having this seal. The Lord knows who are his, and let everyone who names the name of Christ depart from iniquity. So God knows those who are his. Malachi 3:16 says that God has a book of remembrance before him for those who fear the Lord. And I wanted to look at Luke 10, verse 20. And it says here, nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rather rejoice because your names are written in heaven. See, their names are written in heaven. And the chapter, it ends with wisdom thwarted. And we're 75% of the way through our study here in the book of Ecclesiastes. We will be wrapping up the study, Lord willing, next week in this book. Very short pass through. And we'll see you next as we're going to be looking at folly and wisdom. And that video is going to be Thursday night. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. We'll see you next in a couple days. God bless.